The new way of Jesus, Mark 2 and Mark 3 verses 1 to 6. Jesus came to bring a new way of relating us to God, a way of purity and of faith and of love. And that was completely new compared to the Old Testament. So in this talk, I want to explain the difference as it's illustrated in Mark chapter 2. In that we have the healing of a paralytic man, the calling of Levi, Jesus being asked about fasting, Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath, and in chapter 3 we have Jesus healing a man with a withered hand. So let me read chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. That's the home of Peter, probably, where he stayed. So many gathered there that was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them. Since they couldn't get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat that the paralyzed man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." That's a wonderful passage. So they're in the house of Peter, and 4 men bring the paralytic on a stretcher, and they can't get close to Jesus because of the crowd. So they break through the roof tiles, and there was earth, there was grass. It was a flat roof. You got in those houses in Palestine, you got there from an outside stairs, and the flat roof was for clothes, drying clothes probably, and sleeping in the summer outside. And they let down the stretcher to where Jesus was, and Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven you," to the man. "Your sins are forgiven you." And he saw their faith. This is a wonderful thing. He saw an active faith, probably not just the 4 friends of this paralytic, but the man himself. And faith is not just something that's in the mind believing about Jesus, but active, something that you do. Often when there's opposition, when there's difficulty. And I want to read Jeremiah 29, verse 13, and what the Bible tells us about faith. Here in 29:13, it says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." The reason that some people don't get through to God, don't have salvation, is they don't seek him with all their heart. Their hearts are divided. They have all sorts of other things they're seeking. But if we seek God with all our hearts, we'll find him. God will answer. It has to come from the heart. He'll give light, he'll give salvation, he'll give healing, and he'll start working in our lives. So don't be passive. Break through the barriers, all the things against faith, like depression, ignorance, despair, opposition from the family. Break through. Mark 1:23 says, all is possible to those that believe. 9:23. So it may involve reading the Bible, asking men of God or women of God about Christianity, about faith, and learning by reading the Bible, talking to these people, or listening to messages. Faith is the key to knowing God. Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven." He knew that the illness of this paralytic was linked to his sin. He had a word of knowledge. He didn't know it by talking to the man, but he just knew it. And sometimes physical suffering is the result of sin, and it needs to be forgiven before there's healing. In John 5:14, Jesus healed a man who was lame, and he said, "You're healed." And his disciples said, "Who sinned?" And he said, "Neither him nor his parents. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It's wrong. He said, "Don't sin more to this man." But in the story in John 9 verse 2, the sickness wasn't linked to sin, and that's when his disciples asked, "Who sinned?" And he said, "Neither him nor his parents." That was a blind man that was healed. So if you're praying for somebody that's sick, or you feel ill or sick yourself, ask God to show you if there's some sin that needs to be confessed. It can often be lack of forgiveness. So forgive somebody, and that may unblock the healing. Often it's a good idea to ask a person you're praying for, is there some sin that you feel you haven't told God about? Jesus has authority to forgive sin. This is a new way. The Pharisees and leaders had never seen that before. He has the authority to clean up, to change, to transform, to set free from sin. The masters of the law in verses 6 to 7 were very upset by this, and they said in verse 6 and 7, some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Again, Jesus wasn't talking to these lawyers, these religious leaders, but he knew from his contact with God the Father that that's what they were thinking. Only God can forgive sin. So Jesus was claiming to be God, and this was a new way to see God in human form on earth. Only God can forgive sins. Verses 8 to 12. Immediately he knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He said to the paralytic, "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." He commanded that man, and the man got up. That's the power of Jesus' words. Jesus' words are powerful with authority. This amazed them. The man walked out in full view of them all, and they praised God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." This was this new way of Jesus. To actually heal the man was something visible. To forgive him was something invisible, but the healing confirmed what Jesus had already done in forgiving his sins. In the next section, we have the calling of Levi, verses 13 to 17. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, well, that's Matthew, one of the disciples, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth, a sort of hut out in the open. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. So it wasn't just Levi. Levi had a feast, made a feast, and invited all his friends, and they also followed Jesus. When the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So in the first place, Jesus called Levi to be one of his disciples and an apostle. He was a person that collected taxes, and especially in Capernaum, where it was a fishing industry, there was a lot of fish sold, and Levi was employed by the Romans to collect their tax. But he not only took the tax, but stole money. He asked for more money from the fishermen and the other business people than was legal and righteous. And so he was a corrupt man. He was a traitor because he worked with the Romans. He was a collaborator. He was hated. He was a thief. He was dishonest. And yet God called him. That shows the love of God, that he calls sinners to follow him, people like us who are conscious of our own sinfulness. He called him to be a disciple, to follow him. And then Levi had made a party, invited all his friends, and in the Bible it says other tax collectors, but also sinners. Well, aren't we all sinners? This is a special term used in Judaism, meaning the people that have been thrown out of the synagogue. They weren't the ones who obeyed the law of Moses, and they were thrown out. So they were non-practicing Jews. So God called them out as well to follow Jesus. And the teachers of the law were offended at this, what a rabbi had done. A rabbi was having fellowship or friendship with sinners. And Jesus said, a doctor only works with the people that are not healthy, the sick people. He doesn't work with healthy people. And so he's called the unrighteous to follow him. And it says, I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. The Pharisees were righteous in a legalistic way, following the letter of the law, but they were inside corrupt, but they didn't realize that they needed Jesus. Luke 19:10 says, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. He came to save those people who admit their sin and their need. And Jesus is the friend of sinners. That's a wonderful thing that we learn in Mark's Gospel and all the Gospels. But here we have an illustration of it with this story of Jesus calling Levi to be a disciple. The religion of the legalist, of the religious leaders of the day, was that holiness was consisting of being separate from sinners and separate from sin. Jesus showed that he loved the sinner. He loves the sinner now, but he hates the sin. And so for us, we can learn from this to be friends of people at work, friends of family who are not Christians, friends with neighbours. We have to show love, not participating in their sin, but going out and being in conversation with them, talking to them, and especially showing kindness towards them. In the next section, Jesus tackles the question of fasting, verses 18 to 22. The disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with him. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins. What is he talking about? Here we have three illustrations. That when the groom is at the party of the wedding, nobody's fasting. They're all eating and drinking and having a fun time. So Jesus is saying, I am the groom. I'm the one that wants to marry the church. So he brings in a new idea about fasting. This is a new way about fasting. When you have a tear or a hole in a garment, you can't put a new patch on it. it breaks the garment. So you need a new patch on a new garment. You can't mix the old with the new. So again, what is Jesus talking about? The old is the old covenant, which I'll explain in a minute, and the new is the new way that Jesus established. You can't put new wine into an old wineskin, because the new wine will ferment, will start becoming alcoholic, and will burst the wineskin. Again, you can't mix the old with the new, but Jesus is establishing new wine, new teaching, and a new wineskin, a new way of looking at salvation. And it's showing that he's substituting, or he was substituting, and he still does, the old covenant, the way of obeying God's laws and rules, ceremonies, and killing animals, and bringing in a new rule, which is the rule of his death on the cross, and salvation. And the three words which characterized this new way of Jesus are love. He came to show us love and kindness. There wasn't that much love in the old system with the Ten Commandments, the love to God and love to neighbor, but it was the inability to love other people. It was very hard. No one could love God with all their heart. But Jesus was saying, when I come and live in you, you can love others and you can love God. The second word is grace. In the Old Testament was just legalistic, following rules and laws. But in the New Testament, God gives us power, it gives us ability. That's grace. God works. In the Old Testament, the Jews were only commanded to fast once a year, and the rabbis, the religious leaders, have made up more and more rules, and they said no, you had to fast on Mondays and Thursdays. These were man-made rules. So Jesus came not to abolish the Ten Commandments, they're still operative, they're still in force, but to bring in grace and love. And the third thing is faith. When we believe God, when we trust him and trust his salvation, then we can live a Christian life. These are new things that Jesus brought in. For example, today you have churches, the Catholic Church, that says if you don't go to the Mass, that's sinful. But that's an example of legalism. We have a new way now with God. He doesn't demand we go to church. He doesn't demand in a scrupulous way that's very pernickety that we do things in order to feel good with God. But we do it because we want to go to church, we want to read the Bible, we want to give money, we want to love, because we have Jesus living in us. We make a commitment to go to church. We live by principles, but and we want to go to the meetings, but we have a desire now, not an obligation. So fasting is voluntary. It's useful, it's important, but it's not a way of earning salvation. And so Jesus is teaching a new way in terms of laws. If, for example, we have to miss the meeting because we have a death in the family, the Lord understands those things, and we need to be with our family. Or if there's a tragedy of another kind, or if we're ill, it's not sin to do that, to miss the meeting. Or if we go through a really difficult time financially and we can't give what we would like, it's not sin because we can't give, but we do things before God with a peaceful heart in faith. The next section talks about Sabbath, observing God on the Sabbath. For the Jew, that was from Friday dinner time when it was dark, right up to Saturday when it was dinner time when it got dark. And it's one of the 10 commandments that we're to observe the Sabbath. But again, not rigidly, not in a pernickety way, but in the principle of it, to choose one day a week when we try not to work. But we know that nurses have to work, doctors have to work on the Sabbath. For us, is usually for Christians, it's a Sunday, the first day of the week that the apostles started meeting together. But it doesn't mean we can't cook. For the Jews, they weren't allowed to cook. There were lots of things they weren't allowed to do on the Sabbath. They weren't allowed to walk more than a few paces. It had become a whole system of rules which made life very difficult. Let me read in verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was walking through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain, which was, when a Jew was hungry and he was walking through, he could do that. But for these leaders, they criticized Jesus. They said in verse 24, look, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? So they made up their rules. And actually, for a Jew, the only thing they weren't allowed to do was to harvest the maize or the corn on a Sabbath, not pick a few grains just because they were a little bit hungry. He answered in verse 25, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. So through need, David and his companions ate the showbread, which was in the temple. And verse 27, then he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. So Jesus is showing, again, this new way, this new path. He's Lord, and we do what he says in our lives. We don't just reject all the moral laws of the Old Testament, but we let God lead us. He's Lord of all our life, and he's not like that, all rigid and hard. And if, like I said, if we need to go on a Sabbath to a hospital, or we need to do some work that's can't wait, that's an emergency, we can do that. On the whole, for myself, I try and keep Sunday, and I have some time on a Friday as well, when I don't do any work at all. And it's very helpful, but obviously need to cook and wash up. But that's a personal thing between you and God. And so we get to chapter 3 and verse 1. Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And the rabbis and the leaders were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They watched him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man, stand up in front of everyone. In the Old Testament, the Jews were allowed to help a mother in childbirth, but they weren't allowed to help an animal that was giving birth. So you see how rigid and hard they were. Anyway, he said to him, stand up. This was a challenge because they knew that Jesus was going to produce a new way of working with people out of kindness and compassion. Jesus said, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do evil, and to save life or to kill? They remained silent because that was the important question. Jesus came to do good and show us a way of life, to bring life to people, not to kill them. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill him. So they were afraid, with this man of love and kindness and purity, and this new way of faith and of grace, that their place would be substituted by Jesus. One verse which is very helpful for us is in John 1:17, which says that the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. So the subject of this chapter and this talk is that Jesus came to bring a new way, the way through his blood, through his cross. That's the New Testament. The Old Testament was living by laws, and no one practically could do that, could succeed. But in the New Testament, Jesus writes the laws in our hearts. We still have to honour our parents. We still have to love God with all our hearts. We still have to observe a Sabbath in the way that God leads us. We still have to stop stealing, etc., not committing adultery. But the difference is we're not doing it in order to get near to God. We're doing it out of obedience when we know God, when we're saved. So I hope this chapter has been helpful. It's the new way of Jesus that he established. God bless you.